Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So for some of you who engage regularly with Jewish learning, and those of you who are academics, you know that teaching about the historical transformation of anything in 15 minutes is a challenge in and of itself, but we're going to accept that challenge. I was trying to think about how to relate this week's Parsha to the conversation about anti-Semitism. It's not so obvious. That being said, as I listened to Rabbi Kling-Perkins, as I reread the Parsha this morning, I was thinking about what it means for having impurity and the idea of impurity and how anti-Semitism in and of itself is an impurity that plagues our society. I was also thinking about Pesach as it nears, also because I have to clean Rabbi Kling-Perkins, but because also it's in the Torah when Pharaoh is the first to notice of the Israelites and labels them, you, Bnei Israel, you, children of Israel. And he others them in a way to say, you're different than us. And that is a piece of the history of anti-Semitism. We know that that othering is one that has continued to impact the Jewish community throughout history. It is that othering that can lead to the demonization, that can lead to the dehumanization, and it's that othering that continues, whether it's from the hard political right, the hard political left, whether it's focused on Judaism as a religion, Jews as a people, or the movement for self-determination and the collective identity for the state of Israel, is plagued by an othering. So very briefly, in 15 minutes, I'm going to share with you, which I did last year also as well, just a framework to think about how Jew hatred has transformed and how it exists and manifests to the present. We, of course, could start in a period during the Roman Empire. We could look at, for example, as we see the emergence of the development of Christianity, when we begin to understand that a covenantal relationship, in theory, is understood to have been replaced. It's no longer Jews as the chosen people, but that new covenantal relationship is one that emphasizes the relationship between Christians and now God. And that new covenantal relationship supersedes the previous covenantal relationship. Those theological frameworks that are developed within Christianity then are articulated and formulated by the church fathers. They are concretized by the Catholic Church in a European context and influence what we would now refer to as church-state relations, both top-down and bottom-up, meaning the idea that the church and the leadership of Europe, kings, are then going to portray in a particular fashion Jews as Christ killer. They are going to suggest that Jews contaminate society because of their particular beliefs and practices. It is in the period of the medieval time, around 1099, the 11th century, in which we see the first blood libel. The idea that Jews ought to use human blood from non-Jews for their cultural and ritual practices. This idea, of course, as we know, like misinformation, has no boundaries. It spreads and it infects an entire society. That idea of depicting Jews ultimately as those who seek to harm, those who seek to seduce non-Jews for ritual practices, is one that continues to morph and be weaponized to the present. It's also important to note that what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. Yes, anti-Semitism, as it began, we would call Judeophobia, Jew hatred, anti-Jewish sentiment, before it's referred to as anti-Semitism historically. It has its roots in a European context, but we also know that even in the Arab world, the way in which Jews are depicted within some Islamic texts, and understanding how Jews are perceived in the Arab world in which they have to identify themselves as Jews by wearing a yellow Star of David so that they are understood to be the other, the idea of being a dhimmi, a second-class citizen, the idea of having to pay a special tax, a jizya, in order to be protected, and of course, the notion of jihad, holy struggle and war against the infidel, of which the Jew was. When any of these theological frameworks become intersect with political frameworks, these theological political frameworks long-term have an impact on understanding the way in which the Jew ought to be understood and perceived in society. This hatred of Judeophobia does not stay only as a hatred of Judaism. By the period of the 19th century, we begin to see that that hatred is morphing, one, into focusing on Jews as a people. Jews can no longer just merely convert from their religion, Judaism, to another religion, Christianity, in order to be accepted. Why? Because DNA itself is immutable. If your DNA is immutable, it means that irrespective of whether you convert, you still ultimately at your core hold on to this Jewishness and this Jewish identity. You compound that with the pseudoscience of eugenics that was emerging during this period of the 19th century, as well as the idea that Jews in a European context were once again othered. They are the consummate other. They are labeled the Semite, they are labeled the Easterner, they are labeled the Oriental. Conversion is not a solution, and you begin to see, as you see the dissolving of the empires and the emergence of nationalisms as nation states begin to come to the fore, that now there is a desire to connect blood and soil. And that connection between blood and soil is then going to be for sure at the expense of the Jews. You see this for sure during the period of the 20th century. We know of it because of what happens to the rise of Nazism and the ideologies of Nazism, in which these Aryan ideas and the impurity of those who are not pure Aryans are going to be targeted and utilized as the scapegoat to blame all the ills of society. This then is a hatred towards Jews as a people. And that hatred of Jews towards a people and the labeling of Jews by Wilhelm Marr as the target when he articulates the term antisemitumus is when we begin to talk about anti-Semitism as we often think about it today. So we've now gone from a point in time in which it is hatred of Jews because of their religious beliefs, then it is a hatred of Jews because of their identity as a people. During the late 20th century and 21st century, or mid-20th century, we start to see a shift as well. And that shift is no longer just about Jews. We begin to see it during the period of the Russian Empire into the former Soviet Union. Jews and Zionists become synonymous with one another. It is now not only Jews control the media, Jews control the banks, Jews control the governments. It is now Zionists control the media, Zionists control the banks, Zionists control the government. This was a very intentional usage of the term Zionism. The influence of the Soviet Union using that term is absorbed by the Arab world, in which the Soviet Union has a vested interest during this period in time in order to try to create greater alliance with the Eastern Bloc in order to minimize America's involvement in the region. And that terminology and language, synonymous of Jews and Zionism, is then picked up throughout the Arab world. But it doesn't stop there. Leading international organizations like the United Nations also utilize the same language, and you see this most explicitly in UN Resolution 3379, which it clearly articulates that Zionism is a form of racism. That language is one in which, even though ultimately by the mid-1990s that UN resolution is repealed or revoked, it has done its damage. Israel, equal to apartheid, is now understood to be the quintessential sin and the epitome of what it looks like to advocate and advance a relationship with a nation state that ultimately encourages racism. This has then led to the discussion in the late 20th, early 21st century around what does it mean when the nation state of Israel and the national movement of Zionism as a collective is demonized, delegitimized, and held to a double standard. It didn't just stop with Natan Sharansky's 3D test, but we even saw last May during the Hamas-Israel conflict that it was not about a nuanced discussion regarding Israeli policy and decision-making around what to do with settlements or what to do with the Netanyahu government. That's an acceptable, constructive, critical discourse that exists within Israel. It exists outside of Israel, and many of us engage in that kind of discourse. This was the starting place of, does Israel have a right to exist? And the ultimate answer was no. It not only was about, does Israel have a right to exist, but it was the assumption that Jews, all Jews, irrespective of one's relationship with the state or with the ideas of Zionism, ultimately are perceived as an extension of Israeli behavior and Israeli action. We know how problematic that is throughout history, just as we see today innocent Russians being accused of being extensions of Putin's behavior, or as we saw during the coronavirus, Asian Americans being perceived as an extension of problems happening within China. So painting Jews as ultimately responsible and holding them accountable for Israeli governmental actions is another manifestation, I would argue, of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred in the 21st century. Now we know that Jew hatred is not going anywhere. We know that it exists on the political hard right. We know that it exists on the political hard left. And we know that it exists within radical Islamism, both within this country and beyond this country. For many American Jews, identifying Jew hatred on the hard right is actually something we're well practiced with. We understand the history of white supremacy. We understand the violence and the language weaponized by organizations who seek to continue to other the Jews and perceive Jews as never being able to be white. Whether it is the events in Charlottesville, where we heard the chants once again that Jews will not replace us, whether it's from political leaders on the hard right, or whether it is through those individuals who regularly denounce the existence of the Holocaust and Jews as the individual in the collective community who were murdered by the millions. These are expressions we understand. We also see Jew hatred on the hard left. And I would argue it's very hard for many American Jews to understand the way in which it manifests on the hard left. Partly because the discourse is one in which, for many of us, we care about what is happening in many of the progressive communities, and therefore feel challenged and unsure how to navigate, label, and articulate what we see happening within those communities that we feel connected to and allies with and for. On the hard left, the discourse has been one in which Jews are perceived as white and privileged, even though you just heard the hard right does not see us as white. Jews are often labeled as the oppressor, the colonialists, the imperialists. Jews are asked to choose between their particularism and their universalism, which means they have to dissociate from their affiliation or identity connection with Zionism. And this particular form of anti-Semitism is a form termed by Ben Freeman as erasive anti-Semitism. It is a form of anti-Semitism that demands that you erase those affiliations of Zionism associated with a collective national movement in order to elevate your identity with the universal. When we do not recognize these forms of Jew hatred across the ideological and political spectrum and only focus on one, I would argue we actually are playing into the hands of the Jew haters who ultimately seek to create a wedge issue out of anti-Semitism and use it as a political football. So our responsibility, I believe, along with the non-Jewish world with whom we ought to be building bridges proactively, not just retroactively, is to find ways to sensitize, educate, in order to ameliorate and mitigate the Jew hatred that I'm afraid to say will continue to persist. I am not one of these individuals who believe that you can combat and eradicate anti-Semitism forever. And that's because ultimately I believe that Jew hatred is predicated upon the human characteristic of envy. If Jews are envied, then ultimately it means that as a human characteristic, Jews will continue to be othered, to be blamed, and to be isolated for a variety of challenges because it is a conspiracy theory that morphs and mutates in order to fit the imagination of the anti-Semite. As a conspiracy theory, Jews are perceived as being able to control all of society. And so we are both pushed down and at the same time raised up. And in that equation, it ultimately means that Jews will continue to be targeted, and therefore our responsibility is to sensitize, to educate, and ultimately long-term to build meaningful connections with other communities so as to ensure that they understand who Jews are, what Judaism is, why Sion and Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael remain relevant and resonant to the Jewish communities today and forevermore. That's legit 15 minutes. That's not bad, guys. Thank you.